So I'm Eleanor Powers. I'm one of the co-founders of Harvard Alumni for Climate and the Environment, as well as its Director of Programming. Thank you for all coming back and joining us for our second program on COP28, co-sponsored by both HACE and the Salata Institute. We have a great panel today, as well as an audience that includes alumni, students, and others from the university community. Before we get started, I'll just give you a couple of key pieces of information about HACE and then hand it over to Una Gaffney, who will talk about the Salata Institute. And then we will hand over to our moderator, Marianne Mensah, founder of the Climate Innovation Lab, who will introduce our panelists. I want to give a special thanks to all who helped to develop this program. For those of you who are not familiar with us, HACE is the only alumni organization, official alumni organization under the Harvard Alumni Association that is focused exclusively on climate and the environment. We're an entirely volunteer-run organization and are open to alumni as well as students, professors, researchers, administrators, and others in the wider community around Harvard. We are now over 2,500 members and represent all pieces of the college as well as the grad school. If you're not a member, we would really urge you to join us. We have many opportunities for career, for education, and for community and for paths to action around climate, and we would welcome you as part of our bigger community. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Una, who will be representing Salata Institute for our introductions.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you. Yeah, let me first just say thank you to all of you for being here, and a special thanks to the HACE team who played a really large hand in organizing this Zoom event. I'm Una Gaffney. I'm a program manager with the Salata Institute. For those of you who may or may not know, the Salata Institute is a fairly new organization at Harvard. The Institute serves as a fulcrum for collaboration across Harvard University. And one of our core mission is we seek to establish Harvard as a leader in climate education and climate research. And we also seek to establish Harvard as kind of an important resource for the development of real-world climate solutions. So we are a newer organization, but this past December, we had some activities at COP28. I'd just like to highlight for you, we ran our COP Student Observers Funding Program. We sent 15 students to the COP. So in collaboration with the Harvard Project for Climate Agreements and Harvard University's Center for the Environment, we allocated about $30,000 to fund those students to attend. So we're really excited about that. And we have Cynthia Yue, who was one of the recipients on the panel today. So excited to have her here. And then I'll also mention that at COP28 this year, we convened, alumni, faculty, and students in Dubai at a Salata Institute organized event in partnership with the HBS Alumni Club. We held the event on December 7th. And it was a really great opportunity to convene people in the region around COP28 and discuss some of the important work that's going on, specifically around methane emissions reduction. So with that, I'll just turn it back over to Eleanor. I'm happy to answer any questions if people have them. You can feel free to message me in the chat. Oh, Eleanor, I think you might be muted.
Yes, I think you're right. So thank you very much, Una, and now we'll be turning it over to Marianne Mensah, who is going to be our moderator for today. Thank you, Marianne.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to moderate this event. So I'm calling from France. And I'm the founder of the Climate Innovation Education Lab, and I'm also a lecturer in higher education on climate change. And I was at COP28 as a member of an observer organization. So it's my great pleasure to welcome today in our panel Diksha Bijlani, who is HKS alum. She's a IFI Reform Lead Climate Finance Partnership for the COP28 Presidency. We also have Robert Stowe, who is a Harvard College alumni and the co-director of the Harvard Program on Climate Agreements, and Cynthia Yue, who is a HKS MPP candidate. She's also an international human rights, climate action, and social equity leader and advocate. So what a wonderful panel tonight to reflect on what was accomplished at COP28, but also highlight possible shortcomings and also importantly, what comes next. So my first question to you is about, of course, what about the major achievements that happened at the COP28. And maybe I will ask Diksha to first answer this question.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And the last time, I spoke at the HACE event was like a few weeks before COP, and I came in then with more of a cautious optimism, and what was achieved did indeed surpass my expectations on certain themes. It was the first ever COP which was doing the global stocktake, which is sort of a report card of the Paris Agreement. And so the main outcome of the COP was going to be the global stocktake cover decision. And we already knew the key themes were going to be the fossil fuel language, it was going to be loss and damage, finance. And in the end, I think COP28 did deliver something historic on each of these themes, although I do think that historic doesn't necessarily mean it's impactful or it is exactly what we need to stay on track, but it is unprecedented and it does show a major course correction that the GST called for. And some people did say that it was the only GST that mattered, because the GST is going to be every 5 years. Now the next one is going to be 2028, but this is really the only opportunity we had for a major course correction so that we could stay within 1.5. So I can talk about the major achievements on the several themes such as mitigation, loss and damage, finance and adaptation, but really the key ones are mitigation, loss and damage, and certain elements of finance. On mitigation, for the first time ever, we were able to see some fossil fuel language, on transitioning away from fossil fuels. And importantly, it didn't say unabated fossil fuels. It just said transitioning away from fossil fuel, which was in and of itself a major achievement. I do think that it comes 2 decades too late in a COP context, but then again, it is a party-driven process. And someone I really respect as a negotiator once told me that these kinds of achievements in a COP text, this kind of COP text actually isn't in and of itself an achievement. What it does is it provides hooks for what we need to push countries and non-state actors to do in the future. So it did provide that hook that, as Simon Steele, the UNFCCC Executive Secretary said, this is the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era. So we didn't close the chapter on fossil fuel, he said, but it marked the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era. And the funny thing was that even Al Gore, who was, a very stout critic of the presidency for some of the right reasons, also came out to say that this decision did send a very clear, strong signal to the fossil fuel industry, which was present there in huge numbers. So that was, I think, very significant. And equally significant, I think, was that it also included a call to triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency by 2030. Which is extremely important, because if we can really deploy this in a way that can be substituting the fossil fuel capacity, it can be transformational, and it's by 2030, so it's by the end of this decade. So that was really, really great. And also there were achievements on methane, which is, as we all know, a low-hanging fruit when it comes to emissions reductions. There were oil companies such as Shell, Exxon Mobil, and Saudi Aramco that came together to commit to end methane gas flaring by 2030. And in parallel, there were finance commitments announced for methane reductions to the World Bank. So that was also very significant. But also on the mitigation side, there was the first ever commitment to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. And countries, like there was a coalition of 17 countries that came together to say that we will only sustainably manage wood from sustainably managed forests. We will commit to low carbon construction. So all of these were extremely important because we didn't just stay within the fossil fuel realm. We also kind of, stepped over to acknowledge that there are emissions from food systems. There were, for the first time ever, more than 100 countries, actually 150 countries, came together to sign a declaration on food systems, saying that we will reduce emissions from food systems as part of our nationally determined contributions and also make food systems climate resilient. So the fact that there was so much focus on so many different sectors when it comes to mitigation, I think was a remarkable achievement when it comes to COP28. On loss and damage, for the first time ever, an issue that has been stuck for decades, even I was pleasantly surprised to see so much movement. It was the first COP actually where the agenda was adopted on the first day. Funny as it sounds, we've never had a COP where they didn't squabble over the agenda for at least the first week. So we had the agenda adopted on the first day, and we had the loss and damage fund adopted at the same time, with pledges now over 790 million, which it's a drop in the bucket when it comes to the needs. But again, as Simon Steele said, it's an initial down payment that has been made on an agenda that has been stuck for decades. It's going to be a fund that's going to be hosted at the World Bank for 4 years initially, and if the World Bank is able to administer it well and disperse the finance on time and in an equitable way, then the World Bank will continue to host the loss and damage fund for time to come, with the fund being answerable to the UNFCCC core parties. So that, I think, was also a remarkable achievement. And one would say that we don't really think that 800 million really cuts it for loss and damage. So France and Kenya actually announced a task force on global taxation, where they will actually explore taxation of oil and gas, aviation industry, shipping industry, financial transaction taxes, like small levies that can also fund loss and damage by polluting industries. So I think that was also a very remarkable achievement on the non-negotiation side when it comes to loss and damage. And now we have to see sort of where we get to. On finance, I think that we did a great job with the GCF replenishment, with a record replenishment of the Green Climate Fund, with the major commitments over 300 million to the adaptation fund and the least developed countries fund. And these are important because they are UNFCCC mechanisms. But at the same time, I think that given that this year there was no really contentious finance issue on negotiations, the real test of finance within a COP context will come next year, when we have to when we have to conclude the new collective quantified goal, which, so to speak, is the new finance commitment that developed countries will be making to assist developing countries in their transition. But there was like positive signals that the previous part of this commitment, which was 100 billion, has been met, which did help us in pushing through negotiations. We also saw UAE launch a $30 billion fund, which is, they're saying it's the largest ever private investment fund for specifically for climate, and it's going to be deployed. It's already starting to deploy a lot of projects in Africa. So I think this is something that we need to watch out for, like how this fund deploys its vast resources, and 5 billion of that money actually is concessional. So that can actually make a huge dent in when it comes to the deployment of renewables, because UAE has a lot of experience there too, and when it comes to financing nature, for example. So we need to see, and for the first time ever, we also saw a joint statement between the biodiversity COP and the UNFCCC COP, with China and the UAE launching a joint statement. And now actually we have a troika, which is Brazil, Azerbaijan, and UAE working together as a formal working group to implement the GST outcome. So I think that, in terms of what we achieved, we were able to provide a hook with which the future round of NDCs are going to be informed, which are going to be due in Brazil as part of this GST. But we need to, and also one thing I forgot to mention is that this COP, the role of the youth champion was formalized as well, which means that every year now at every COP, we are going to have a youth, formally appointed youth champion leading on the COP agenda, which is actually really exciting. So I think all of these things, they provide good hooks for us. I really need to thank the civil society, Indigenous people and local communities that were there, that engaged, that protested on the ground, because it's really a result of their advocacy that we were able to get what we were able to get. I'm sure you all read news about how heated up it got in the end moment with the decision text draft that was released that didn't mention fossil fuels. And then there were so many protests in Dubai that I personally also saw. They really did make a big dent in what we were able to achieve in the end. So I think we need to continue now this advocacy to ensure that this is implemented in practice in this critical decade. And so that when we come to the next GST, which is in 2028, we can really look ourselves in the mirror and say that, it wasn't all for nothing. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Diksha. And you already touched upon some topics that really Rob and Cynthia are really also very much working on. So Rob, what is your take on the achievements of COP28?
As in our pre-COP briefing a few weeks ago, I have virtually nothing to add to what Diksha said. That was a comprehensive and very interesting presentation, and I personally learned a number of things from it. I guess just very briefly, I would mention that, looking at a high level, it was very important that the United States and China are collaborating again with regard to the process, the Paris Agreement and related processes. One example that I was particularly interested in was a so-called methane summit that was held on the first day of the COP with China, the US, and also the Presidency, the UAE, at which a great deal of new funding was announced for methane mitigation, as well as other steps of progress in that regard. And methane more generally, as Diksha already mentioned, played a big role. And this is very important because, methane has much higher global warming potential than does carbon dioxide, and yet has a very short lifetime in the atmosphere. So as Diksha mentioned, it's a low-hanging fruit because of those two things. We can have a fairly big impact on warming in a very short period of time by reducing methane emissions, which gives us a little more wiggle room to work on carbon dioxide, which is a tougher nut to crack. I think that's all I'll say. I do have a couple of comments when we get to where the COP fell short, but I'll hold off on those.
Okay, thank you. I turn now to Cynthia. So as also a youth activist, what were your observation about the main achievements of this COP?
Of course. I mean, I would definitely echo Rob and Diksha. I feel like Diksha is just an encyclopedia for COP. And so she truly captured so much of what we saw as the positives of what came out of COP. And just as Rob said, as a person who's American, but also of Chinese descent, being able to attend the Methane Summit and to see the US and China collaborate on something so critical to our future was something that I felt was really empowering as a young person. I think just to add onto what's already been said, I think inclusivity at this COP was something that we saw done in an unprecedented way. And what I mean by that is that I think that the presidency did a really great job in trying to ensure that as many people as possible were a part of the process. And it fell short in many ways, which, just as Rob said, I'm really excited to talk about in the next section. But just in terms of the number of attendings, this is the largest COP ever, with over 80,000 people who registered in advance. And then during the week, I think it was over 100,000 who ended up attending the COP itself. And so within that large registration, there was more youth representation ever before. When we look at the numbers from the first COP, where there were almost no youth attendees at all, to here, where there are thousands and thousands of people coming from across the globe who are all under the age of 35, it was truly magical to see Generation Z and Generation A being able to have a seat at the table and being able to have this chance to not only see negotiations and the policymaking process up close, but also being able to be on the sidelines and protest and talk about how the very things that are being negotiated in the next room are going to impact our futures. That was really powerful for us.
Yes, thank you. And actually, relating to this topic of youth empowerment was education, because this COP had a pavilion dedicated to education. And I think that was also a very encouraging start for the inclusion of this topic in the negotiation. What were the shortcomings? What could have been better at this COP? And here I open the floor to the three of you. Who would like to start with question? Rob?
Sure. I'll mention a couple of points that are important to me, though these are rather technical and perhaps somewhat obscure. First of all, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement deals with international cooperation formally, but in fact, it deals with advancing market mechanisms to address climate change. There is an element on non-market mechanisms as well, however. After moving forward fairly significantly in the last two COPs in Article 6, the negotiations to really finalize the mechanisms for Article 6 fell apart rather dramatically. Strangely enough, including arguments between the US and Europe on certain aspects of Article 6, which those two parties are usually on the same page. It had to do with issues around the integrity of carbon removals. The environmental integrity is what I mean, whether you can really ensure that these are having a good impact on the environment, including greenhouse gas reductions, but also other environmental impacts. And there were a couple of other issues that, for someone not really immersed in this part of the negotiations, may seem like they could be addressed, but they weren't. So that was a disappointment. The other point I would add is that while, along with everyone else, I'm delighted that the decision of the COP called for a tripling of renewables. I was disappointed that the decision didn't say something about the fact, and it is a fact, that it'll be impossible to achieve that tripling of renewables without a very dramatic improvement and expansion of our power infrastructure around the world. We're reaching the point in some jurisdictions where renewables have penetrated far enough that the constraint is no longer the cost of the generation of renewable electricity, but rather the transmission and distribution of that electricity, building new power lines, building a new IT infrastructure to manage large penetrations of renewable electricity. This is technical, and the decision didn't have to go into a lot of detail, but I wish it had mentioned that because it's going to be necessary to achieve that goal. I think I'll leave it at that. Those are the 2 points that were important to me.
Thank you, Rob. Cynthia, is any other point on the shortcomings of the COP that you'd like to highlight?
Yes, of course. Just to start, as a youth activist, I have to say this. COP predates my existence. In fact, it predates most of my generation's existence. And so just even arriving at the conference at first, of course, I felt incredibly grateful, and thank you to the Salat Institute and the Belfer Center for helping to sponsor my trip to the UAE. But being at COP itself was, it made me feel so upset to see that even after 28 years, we're still failing to unite over very basic things. And we keep on saying things such as, oh, the mentioning of fossil fuels is a great first step. But the reality is just as Diksha said, this is 2 decades too late. And the fact is we're far past the point of first step. And yet many times throughout the negotiations, we kept on lowering our ambitions just with the idea that it was just to take a first step, which for me, as somebody who knows that these decisions are going to impact my generation and the ones to come far greater than most of the decision makers in the room, it felt very shameful, honestly. And even though this was the most inclusive COP ever, a lot of times it felt like we were seen but not heard. And so talking about the food systems aspect of it, which I know was a huge win for the UAE, but at the same time, a lot of times it felt like these spaces were all youth washed. So for example, during the negotiations or during the food systems plenary hall, I was able to stand on stage and talk about the importance of youth and in youth inclusion in the text of these negotiations. And almost the entire room was people from an elderly generation, and they were almost all of them were on their phones. And these same people later gave speeches about how important it is to listen to young people. In many ways, we were there in the room, but we weren't necessarily included in a way that was meaningful to the process. And so I think that future COPs, and not just the COP presidencies, but people who are attending COPs and the key decision makers at COPs need to ensure that we're not just at the table, but we're also given a place to actually have a meaningful participation. And in terms of the negotiations itself, a lot of them were stalled by an oil block. And even within the blue zone, there was one pavilion where when the name itself was very generic, and then when you read the subtext of it under the pavilion's name, it was all oil producers. And the fact that we have a climate conference where in the blue zone there's an entire pavilion that's funded by and represented by oil producers, it was a big red flag as a young person who's a huge climate activist. And you saw how negotiations were strategically stalled by this block over and over again. And so I remember even towards the beginning of the negotiations, as small island states and as developing countries were giving their objections to some of the text, the chairs would continually try to pressure these countries to agree by saying that we were on a timeline. And oftentimes the circulation of texts were given just an hour or 2 hours before a negotiation would start. And so you would hear countries over and over and over giving the same exact speech, which was that they didn't have enough time to read the text, but that they agree with X, Y, or Z, but then they would reframe it by saying they didn't have time to read the text, so they can't agree to it just yet. And this led to the very end, once we got to the very end of COP28 and signed the final text, it was signed when many small island nations were not in the room. And so even though there were these great wins that we see on a global scale within the COP28 text, the reality is that it wasn't fully inclusive, and it was done in a way that rushed people so that there was this pressure to agree on things that weren't as ambitious as needed for the people who are most vulnerable to climate change and its impacts. In so many cases, I was in negotiating rooms where there wasn't enough capacity to hold every single country, to the point where I saw a negotiator in tears telling the person in charge of giving out placards and saying that nobody from her country was in the room. And that's something that's deeply disappointing, because this is supposed to be a global conference where every single party has the same say. And the reality is that there just wasn't enough representation. There was representation, but there wasn't enough equity within that representation. So I'll end it there, but definitely a huge trove of thoughts on this entire topic.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Cynthia. And after the COP, we have heard a very, intense discussion on the organization of the COP and how, they should maybe reframed or change so that they would be more inclusive. So thank you very much for, giving your lively acknowledgement of what happened over there. Diksha, would like to react on what has just been said.
No, thank you so much. I feel like some of you stole some words from my mouth as well, because I had, that's why I'm glad I'm going last, because I can be the most succinct. Personally, I always feel torn over what we could have done more as a team and what are just the shortcomings of a party-driven process, because at some level, because of a consensus-based process, there's only so much you can push for. And so even if you put something in a draft text, unless every single of the almost 200 countries agree to it, it's not going to happen. So on carbon markets, on Article 6, as Rob said, it was a huge disappointment to me. I was there in the late night negotiations, and the co-chairs were super disappointed because they worked for weeks and people just could not agree at all. It was really polarized. So it did feel disappointing, but then again, this is something that has been in the COP negotiations for a long time, and what loss and damage has taught me is that there is a time for everything when it gets decided. Sometimes it's a decade too late, sometimes it's 2 decades too late when it comes to fossil fuel language, but ultimately multilateral processes do take their time. But personally, I was disappointed also with Article 6, the carbon markets negotiation, that it couldn't lead anywhere. I was also hoping for more on the adaptation finance side, because this year was very critical on the global goal and adaptation, which is basically like a framework for measuring adaptation the same way as for mitigation. We have the 1.5 degrees Celsius North Star. We don't have anything the same way for adaptation because it's very context specific. And really, we couldn't, the framework that we have come out with, although it's still, very unprecedented, because for the first time it says we will set universal targets for food and water and health, but that's all that it said, and it didn't come with any new financing per se attached to it. So I was hoping for a lot more on adaptation as well. I was also hoping for a lot more, as Cynthia said, on meaningful engagement and mechanisms for Indigenous people and local communities, for young people, with not just tokenistic representation, but really putting your money where your mouth is. So more mechanisms for direct access for Indigenous people and local communities, where we did see financing announced for nature or health or food. It's really unclear if those will really be direct access, or if it'll just be financing going to countries, which is supposedly supposed to flow to local levels. We did have for the first time a local climate action summit, which was more about subnational action and where cities can play a role, and how financing can go directly to local actors. But it was just the start of a conversation. We need to do a lot more on financing in a meaningful way Indigenous people. We had an Indigenous people pavilion, for example, but the disconnect that I personally felt being at COP, where the pavilion was supposed to have all the events that Indigenous people want to host, and they actually would have a prayer call, every few hours, so you knew where it was. You could, locate it from just the sound of it, but really you saw the integration in the other events very little. So I would have liked a lot more of that meaningful engagement, acknowledging that they do have a lot that we can learn from. Farmers were there, a lot of farmer organizations were there, a lot of people from local communities were there. But we can do as COP and as presidencies a lot more in engaging them in a more meaningful way, rather than just, you know, as part of events, but, you know, really using that momentum to you know, generate new commitments for non-state actors. So I would have liked to see a lot more on basically on inclusion in terms of local actors, and everything that Rob and Cynthia said is absolutely, I agree with, and it's well taken that this has somehow become the nature of, and we really tried, like I said to my team, that we don't want this COP to be just another trade fair, because, you know, with all these pavilions and with all these events, you could literally have like 50 events to go to at any time. We really want to have meaningful action rather than just greenwashing and people just coming and having a nice vacation and then going away. And I think there is scope for much more incremental change on how we the design features that enable a lot more integration across groups, so conversations are not happening in silos.
Thank you very much, Diksha, for such a honest and transparent, you know, also a testimony on what could have been done better at the COP28. And so this is leading me to the question about, you know, the next steps. What are the important next steps according to you in this process of the climate negotiation? Rob, would you like to elaborate on this?
Yes, I think the most important next step is the formulation of new pledges by the parties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to advance adaptation and to advance the other goals of the Paris Agreement, which I believe are due in 2025. And indeed, the global stocktake, which was completed at this COP, is intended to kind of incentivize and catalyze more ambitious pledges by the parties during the next round. The Paris Agreement, just as it calls for a global stocktake every 5 years, it calls for new nationally determined contributions, as these pledges are called, every 5 years, a couple of years later, after the global stocktake. And so in my mind, that's the biggest next step. There are other important next steps too, as Diksha mentioned. You know, advancing adaptation financing is certainly one, and there are others. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Cynthia?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of next steps, I think from the activist perspective, of course, I think that there needs to be a lot more done at a grassroots level too. And so activism, not just for climate justice, but also this meaningful inclusion. And I think that there needs to be an intergenerational revitalization on what we're doing for climate activism. This is something, it's a criticism that I had just throughout my time at COP, which is not just a criticism of elder generations for their lack of meaningful inclusion, but also a deep look inward on what's happening within Generation Z, which is that I know that Diksha said that they didn't want it to be a trade show, but many times it felt like COP28 was climate Coachella, in part because of how it was structured, but also because of how people were interacting within it. And so I saw a lot of members of Generation Z who were more concerned about taking nice photos for Instagram versus actually doing meaningful contributions and participating in protest and activism for climate justice. And so the reality is that there needs to be a lot more done from every single generation to ensure that we're meeting our 1.5 degree Celsius targets and holding leaders of all generations accountable accountable. And we also need a lot of this activism isn't just for us, but also to hold fossil fuel companies accountable too. So ensuring that these large lobbies from a national level aren't taking over our legislation and aren't taking over global conferences the way it felt like it was with COP28. I know that Rob talked about nationally determined contributions and national legislation, and for a lot of countries, the United States included, that really is where a bulk of the work ends up happening. We negotiate a large framework at the UN, but then the actual work gets done at the national level. So combining this grassroots activism with this grass tops reworking of what we've seen at the UN to create a framework that's actually getting us to this 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And I will note with the nationally determined contributions part 2 is that a lot of times youth and indigenous people and people from rural areas are included at places like COP28, but they're not included during the NDC formulations. And so meaningful inclusion isn't just about having them at these big global conferences for 2 weeks, it's about having us at every single step of the process. And so in terms of next steps, it's not just about ensuring that we're included in future iterations of COP, but it's also ensuring that we are represented during the national determined contributions formulation and every step before and in between and after.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for making this very important point. Diksha, you mentioned earlier that climate finance was going to be important, an important issue discussed at the next COP. So could you elaborate a little bit on what should happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my mind, there are so many different threads that we need to follow up on. Finance is obviously a key one there. So, for example, ensuring that the loss and damage fund is set up, that it starts dispersing and it starts dispersing with low transaction costs, because it's very important. We have a limited pot of money and we need to ensure that it's getting to communities that are most impacted. And this fund is also going to be targeting like slow onset events. So not just like disasters, but for example, a prolonged drought that has, for example, the Horn of Africa has had a prolonged drought for years now. So these kinds of events as well. And there needs to be a really clear additionality to the loss and damage fund in the way that it works. So that's one thing that needs to be followed on. The UAE's fund that it has announced on $30 billion, there is a lot of work for all of us and those and others in financial institutions to start collaborating with this fund to ensure that it is actually starting to disburse as well, because although it's a private fund, it has been announced in a COP context and it's a huge pot of money. So ensuring that the partnerships that the fund needs can be made to so that it can start deploying to meet the commitments that have been announced at COP is very important. We saw oil and gas companies sort of sign this charter saying that we will end methane gas flaring by 2030. I would really like for us to follow up on that as well, to ensure that the tracking and monitoring mechanisms are there, because it's not ironically here, the issue is not the big companies, it's actually the national oil companies that don't have the money to invest in the financial case to invest in ending methane gas flaring, because they are much smaller than the BPs and Exxons of the world. So it's very, very important. Next year actually is a big finance agenda that is due, which is called the new collective quantified goal. The way to think about this goal is like this will be a new floor that countries will agree on, as in like we need X billion or trillion to deliver this in the next 5 years to developing countries to meet their NDC commitments, basically. And so far, this goal has been 100 billion, which has not been met for the past 2-3 years. So basically what we need is for these negotiations to end successfully. So far, they have been very, very polarized. Nobody has agreed on anything. And as you can imagine, the biggest contention is the donor base, so to speak, where countries such as the US, UK, all of Europe basically are saying that other countries which are more middle income, like UAE or even India, Brazil, also need to provide climate finance rather than just receive climate finance, because under the current arrangement, countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, like all sort of developing countries, only receive climate finance. They are not obligated to contribute climate finance. So this is a big point of contention in this new finance agenda, and even I'm holding my breath as to what happens next year, because we are mandated to conclude it next year. That's going to be a really big one. And then, like I mentioned, we actually have a working group, a Troika working group between Brazil, Azerbaijan, and UAE, to start implementing everything that has been announced at COP28, and also to start defining the COP to COP handovers and interlinkages between agendas. Because currently the way it's been happening is every presidency just comes out with its own agenda, and then the next one with its own agenda, and there really are very few interlinkages. For example, I wish we had talked more with Egypt and done a lot more with the agenda that they had come out with last year. So I think that is going to be a very key working group to advance a lot of outcomes. And next year actually is a year where 3 COPs are happening: the UNFCCC COP, the UNCBD COP, which is the biodiversity COP, and the UNCCD COP, which is the COP that focuses on land degradation and food systems. So we really have a crucial opportunity to start thinking more in a more intersectional way across sectors, because it's not just about climate, it's about nature, it's about biodiversity, it's about people, it's about health, it's about food systems. Everything is interlinked. And although we tried in this COP to have this soup of everything that we can do at least something on, we need to ensure that next year we can take this forward in a more meaningful way, so that our COP doesn't just become about, just one thing, which is climate and emissions. It is also about all the systems that are as essential to ensuring that we have a sustainable future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And about the role of the private sector, I think is Cynthia who mentioned, the heavy presence of the oil and gas industry. But according to you, what is the role of the private sector in the future in advancing the agenda of climate of the COP? Anyone?
Yeah, absolutely. I can start on that. I actually forgot to mention, I think that on the private sector side, we need to do a lot more on climate tech, and not just like new climate tech, but scaling up like existing technologies. Like, for example, bioplastics. There is no reason that bioplastics hasn't been scaled up. The only reason I can think of is lobbying from the plastic industry. So we need to put a lot more financing, and private sector needs to lead on these solutions that can be scaled up across the world. We need to, with this COP, the messaging has really been for us that we need to bring everyone to the table with like meaningful solutions, and with the commitment coming, at least the commitment in theory coming from oil and gas industry about ending methane gas flaring and decarbonizing the sector, which is not the same as reducing the production or not expanding production. It's basically saying that we will produce oil and gas still, but we'll do it in a more sustainable way so that we can reduce methane. So I think there needs to be a lot more meaningful conversation. And this is not just limited to the oil and gas industry. We also saw the same from a lot of commodity suppliers and big food companies like Nestle and Unilever. They were all there in the food systems event as well. And they supposedly announced a $1 billion commitment altogether, by the way, not each of them, which is a minuscule proportion of their actual. And they said they will commit to X hectares, regenerating X hectares of land. I think that we need to really, the private sector really needs to bring scale, because that's what we really rely on the private sector for. Apart from, making sure that what they're committing to is not just greenwashing, they need to bring the scale. So if the public sector is putting in like $790 million for loss and damage, which is concessional, it needs to be matched with the private sector money, which may be at a more commercial rate, but that's the only way you're going to get scale. So scalable solutions, blended finance solutions need to come from the private sector. And we saw a lot of this at this COP. There were a lot of new funds, like there was a $1 billion fund between philanthropy and private sector that was announced on focus on energy transition, which was really great because for the first time I saw philanthropy actually putting in the concessional money that can de-risk the private sector investments. So I think that those kinds of partnerships, the private sector needs to bring to COP, and it needs to be at a bigger scale than it has been at this COP.
Thank you very much, Diksha. Cynthia, did you want to add something on, the role of the private sector, maybe in youth empowerment, in how in partnerships?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the private sector, just as Diksha said, they play an invaluable role in the climate transition. And the reality is that most emissions come either directly from or are indirectly influenced by the private sector. I think that one thing that my generation has really started to come to terms with is that a lot of times we want to make the sustainable decision, but the sustainable decision isn't an option at all. Right now, especially in the United States, for example, we are so dependent on plastic. Even if you want to make the environmentally conscious decision, it simply does not exist, or it is not obtainable for your average person. And so I think that there's a great way to empower youth is just by making the sustainable option available to all, and to make small, simple decisions and steps to create a more sustainable business structure. And so I would completely agree with Diksha in terms of the private sector's role in these larger scale things such as blended finance and contributing and implementing everything that we discuss at the COP. But also there's a lot that can be done to empower people at an individual level through this transition.
Thank you, Cynthia. Rob, did you want to add something about also the role of the private sector?
Yeah, I do. I think it's important that the private sector participate in the COP because, as Cynthia noted, national governments, and to some extent subnational governments, ultimately are going to formulate the public policy, the laws and regulations that are needed to advance action on climate change. And the private sector are going to be the entities that are regulated and have to obey these laws. So it's good to have them present and in discussion and so on. But, we often heard at this COP and elsewhere that, we're disappointed that oil companies in particular aren't doing more to reduce production. Oil companies are never going to reduce production. Oil companies and other private sector firms are going to do what's in their financial self-interest. And the only way that oil companies are going to reduce production is if demand for oil is reduced. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to put our attention on that. And there are two ways that demand for oil and oil products are going to be reduced, either through carbon pricing on the one hand, or through subsidies for technological innovation in the low carbon and zero carbon sector, or both, or some combination of those two. So it's good that private sector and oil companies are there. Actually, I think they know a lot for one thing, and that knowledge can be useful. And it's great that oil companies are reducing methane and have promised. There was yet another methane collaboration announced at the COP to achieve zero methane emissions by 2030. But that's good. It's better than not reducing methane emissions to zero by 2030. But as I believe Diksha just said, it's not the same as getting rid of oil, which is what we have to do. And oil companies are not going to do that. So I think we have to set our expectations in that regard. I also just want to make a quick comment on an unrelated point. I want to make a very brief defense of the trade show. I went to the COP, and my team went to the COP to, exchange views on methane and to learn more about methane. And it's great having everybody in the world practically that's involved with methane in one place. We had wall-to-wall conversations for practically the whole week we were there. Activism is more important, and real progress in the negotiations and in some side deals is also more important than the trade show aspect. But it's also, that's also useful, I think, and not trivial. So those are my 2 comments on that.
Well, thank you for sharing these insights that were actually really adding also a different perspective on the role of the private sector and how it contributed to the negotiation. We have also we want to leave room for questions from the audience. So I will turn to Eleanor. Are there any questions for our panelists?
Thank you. So I'd like to take the opportunity to allow people in the audience to ask questions. So please put your questions in the chat where we can pick them up. In the meantime, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I do have one of my own, which is more for Diksha and Cynthia, but also for Rob. How can Harvard and the alumni support you and what you do? What could we do for you? How can we help you?
I think that, like, back when I was in HKS, which wasn't that long ago, it was 2018 to 2020, I didn't see as many opportunities for, for pursuing classes in climate, and I'm not saying just at the basic level. I mean, that was there. There were classes on sustainability. I took, I think, one in HBS and sustainable infrastructure as well, which is quite nice. But at a meaningful level, it wasn't integrated as well into the mandatory curriculum as I would have liked it to be. For example, I was the TA for the negotiations class, and we basically had no case study on climate there. Now I think they have one that they're testing out on the Paris Agreement, probably, or in a specialized education course. But I think in that sense, producing better informed students, or students who are, more skilled at following these conversations in the multilateral space. So they, after graduating from Harvard, they can really go into, and then pushing them into those kinds of careers as well. Could be a great contribution. And of course, what you do here at the Salata Institute in Hayes is a big step forward there, but it needs to be more mainstreamed, because I wasn't actually into climate work before I came to Harvard. And then it's actually because of events like these that I also started pursuing one. I also got an internship in one. So you are really producing a huge impact at an individual student level. I just really wish that could be mainstreamed also into the, for example, the MPP curriculum at HKS, where it's bound to have impact on a lot more students' lives. So then, not so many of them would go into management consulting, or even if they do, they can actually think of it as from more of a sustainability lens and bring sustainability, because I read somewhere that every job is a climate job, and we need to really treat it that way. So it would really just be great if those kinds of mainstreaming of in-depth, nuanced climate conversations could happen in the curriculum.
Cynthia, any thoughts?
I completely agree with Diksha, and thank you so much, Eleanor, for all that you're doing as a leader in HASTE, and then also just for asking how HASTE and the Salata Institute can support us. I completely echo what Diksha said. I think one of the large critiques that a lot of my fellow climate activists friends at HKS and I have talked about is just the lack of climate classes and infrastructure that's at HKS. And certainly Salada and HASTE have really been the first big step in doing that. But definitely we would love to see a lot more classes focused on climate and climate policy, because at least for the Kennedy School, it's relatively new. And I was a community cohort representative last year for my cohort in the MPP class. And one of the things that I brought up to the program was if we could make a concentration focused on climate and sustainability for the MPP program, because right now there isn't a concentration focused on climate or sustainability, despite a huge disproportionate number of MPPs being interested in it. And despite, just as Diksha said, every single job being a climate or sustainability job. And so if there could be a larger push for not just the classes offered, but also the actual concentration for MPPs to focus on this, so that once we get out into the real world, we can say that this is something that we actually studied. That would be really helpful. And just talking to a lot of people, and of course, the pool of people that I talk to is of course biased towards activists who care about climate. But that being said, a lot of the people that I talk to who are interested in coming to HKS want to see more climate curriculum and want to focus on climate, but that's simply just not there in the infrastructure. And then finally, as somebody who's on the younger side of HKS, I came to HKS straight out of undergrad. What I've noticed too is that it's very hard for people who come straight out of undergrad or who take just a 1 or 2 year gap to get a job straight out of grad school, because we're in this place where we have this grad degree, but we don't have the quote unquote working experience that they usually see. And so for a lot of the sustainability jobs that younger people on the younger side of HKS want to do, all of them require many years of experience that young people in the MPP program don't necessarily qualify for. And so just as Diksha said, it pushes a lot of people on the younger side to go into things like consulting, because those are a lot of the only jobs that will take people who are in this weird in between. It's not what I want to go into, but it's just one of those things, and it's not what I plan on going into, but it's something that I've seen a lot of my friends choose to do because the infrastructure simply isn't there for the MPP class. And one thing to note too is that the MPP class is getting younger by the year. And so they're admitting more young people and more people who are straight out of undergrad, but that puts more people who are interested in these jobs in that strange place of not being qualified for these sustainability jobs that require 8 years in the energy field versus people who are on the older side of the class.
Great, thank you. So there's a question here from one of our audience, recognizing the catastrophic impact of doing so, was there any discussion of changing the temperature target from 1.5 to 1.75 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees, given the current trajectory, speed of reduced emissions and current climate change effects?
May I say something?
Anybody want? Please.
Yeah, I have something radical to say on that. The horse left the barn a really long time ago, but I don't think temperature goals are useful to begin with. I think there are much better ways to measure our progress to reducing warming. The best, in my personal opinion, being the degree to which emissions growth is reducing. So it's kind of the second derivative of emissions. Bending the curve is a simple way to describe that. So, you know, how much is the curve bending from an upward direction towards a downward direction? 1.5 degrees, it's important. We have it as a goal, and that's not going to change. And it's important to have a goal to measure yourself against. And that's the goal we have, and that's the goal we're going to stick with. But having said that, there's no scientific basis for 1.5 degrees being a threshold for any catastrophic events. You know, 1.5 is better than 1.6. That's what you can say. Having said all of this, I don't believe it's wise to revise the goal upwards at this point. It kind of sends a signal that we're giving up. and may have a disheartening effect. And one of the biggest dangers in dealing with climate change full time is the tendency to get disheartened, because it's very hard and progress is very gradual. So I would tend, just from a motivational point of view, not to revise the temperature target.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Rob. We have quite time for a couple more questions here. There's one from someone else in the audience. What do you see as the biggest missed opportunity from the lack of focus on adaptation? Any thoughts?
I think that, like, from a strategic point of view, if we don't focus on adaptation and then we leave communities without the resilience to cope with climate impacts, which we already know will happen, because we are not, even if we do everything that we can, there is still going to be climate. I mean, we're already having them. You really take away the capacity to engage meaningfully in any sort of climate action. Like, if somebody can't put food on the table, it's very unlikely, like if a farmer can't even make money, it's very unlikely that they're going to shift to regenerative practices, for example. So you basically are, pushing people towards the brink of the desperation, where they have to think again in a more they have to think of survival, actually, instead of organizing as a community, which we see a lot more of now. Like, we see advocacy from farmers, we see advocacy from indigenous people and local communities or youth. But if we don't adapt to the impact of climate, the kind of impacts that we are going to see on livelihoods, on food security, are going to be so vast, and they're going to be context specific. So they're going to be concentrated in certain places, not across the world. And we already saw the kinds of policies that came up with COVID, for example. So when the world is hit with shocks, there's actually a really good book by Naomi Klein on this called The Shock Doctrine. It's clear that when the world is hit with shocks, when people are hit with shocks in their life, their decision making becomes a lot more short term than long term. So it's actually really important for investing in adaptation, because if countries don't, it's very likely that they're going to take a high emissions development trajectory of countries like India and Brazil that have such a huge population to cater to. They're not going to be prioritizing climate if they can't even ensure survival for their people.
Thank you. Thank you. So we had another question with regard to resources and which ones would be recommended to summarize the COP28 and raise questions that are similar to what we're talking about today. And I saw that there are a couple of posts that people have put. If anybody would like to add to that, we're going to include these on our website along with a recording from our conversations today. So please, please feel free to put those into the post.
Thank you for to our panelists for this great discussion and all the insights on what happened at the COP28, because being there, it's such a maelstrom. It's such a, there is so much happening, as Diksha was mentioning earlier, that it's hard to really take a stand back and reflect on what happened. But it's so important to really think about the future. And I think today you gave some really, really important insight on what should be taken into consideration at the next COP. So thank you very much for this interesting discussion.
And thank you all. And I'd like to also take the opportunity again to say, please reach out and tell us if you think there are other ways that the university or that the alumni can be supporting you. And thank you for everything that you do. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.